Washington. Her research centers Black families, diverse forms of educational and spatial agency to deepen understanding of how Black families and communities create places of care, collectivity, and learning in racially and economically unjust U.S. metropolitan regions. Informed by her own upbringing and work across community organizations and schools, Dr. Nickson approaches research and teaching with a deep belief in Black families and communities' multifaceted forms of agency as integral to more expansive and liberatory approaches to educational leadership and practice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nickson. Dr. Nickson.
Alrighty. Thank you, Dr. Okello. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Mary Pierce. Thank you to the Black Study Education Lab for the invitation to join you all today. I am deeply honored to be with you all today, and Black geographic thought and education is my jam. I'm continue to be a learner as I teach. And so, again, just deeply honored to be in conversation with you all today. And I look forward to, of course, sharing about what I'm thinking and have been working on, but also look forward to dialoguing with you all and hearing about the work you're doing and questions that move the work forward. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and get started. All right. Can you, is it in a presenter view? Sorry, y'all. We zoom in and figuring it out.
We can see your slides. We can also see your slide deck on the side.
Okay. My notes. Just give me a minute while I sort through this. It's still split, huh? Let's see. Okay, wait. Okay. I'm gonna figure this out, y'all. All right. Is that good?
There it is. Perfect.
Okay. So today I will talk to you all about a model that I'm grappling with, seeking to understand, called Black Geographies of Educational Leadership. And this work grows from two research studies that I've been privileged to be a part of, one in Metro Detroit and one that recently concluded in Seattle. And I use Catherine McKittrick's Black Livingness framework to make sense of what I'm seeing as Black families, community leaders, organizers, and formal school district leaders are working to create places for Black students and families to not only learn, but to thrive and to experience care and joy in the educational process. So I ground my work today in a quote from Sean Crawley from his book, The Lonely Letters. And Sean Crowley's work is particularly around African American Pentecostal traditions. And he notes how through praise, we can glimpse some of the otherworldly practices, other modalities of existence that exist in the Black church and beyond. And he importantly names that, you know, what happens in those spaces and beyond those spaces help us glimpse the other worlds, otherwise worlds, and what Black and Indigenous and queer folks have been doing. And I start here because in teaching with the Leadership for Learning EDD program at the University of Washington, we read a chapter from the Lonely Letters early in the cohort. It's a 3-year cohort, 3-year program. And we, Black, Indigenous, and some other students of color really latched onto this term of what Black and Indigenous and queer folks have been doing, right? We have these communal histories, these communal models of leadership that have long sustained us, even though we work and live in systems that denigrate Black leaders and the efforts they put towards to connect with communities. And so I just want to frame that uh, this work today seeks to honor these legacies and lineages of Black educational leadership that I hope will show are deeply geographic and are sustained and are provisional and also historic and contemporary. And they help us to understand what we've been doing and how we can move forward. So to situate my own self, really, this is not just my story, ourselves. Um, I starred at my grandparents' home, my maternal grandparents' home, Mary Trotty and the late Archie Trotty Jr. And my grandfather particularly taught in Sunnyside, a historically Black community in Southern Houston, where he and my grandmother lived and raised their 4 children. Growing up, we always spent most holidays at my grandparents' home. And most holidays, a former student, now adult, would stop by the home to wish my grandparents a happy holiday and to share updates on their lives. I can remember that my grandparents, no matter what were doing, if my grandma was cooking, they would always graciously welcome them into their home and they would sit with them and listen and talk. My grandparents were deeply embedded in their community through their profession, and they showed up for their students over time. Now, Sunnyside is a community that was one of the first places south of downtown Houston where Black people could buy homes. And Sunnyside was literally physically made by its residents. They paved the roads. The residents actually built a community center for gatherings and for meetings. Over time, Sunnyside has experienced extensive population loss and also has been subject to anti-Black policymaking in the form of uh, planning and zoning that has led to flooding. And also there have been waste dump sites located in the neighborhood. And still, my grandmother remains in Sunnyside. This is her home. She is a leader in this space, and she also is taken care of by residents now in her older age. And so I start here to just name that my grandparents are a formative example in where I start from. And I also want to invite you all that if there are places or geographies that anchor your practice or leadership, please drop them in the chat. Let's name the places that are sustaining us and where we know from in our leadership and practice. So here, I just want to name that again, and that's why I'm asking you all to drop in the chat. There are wide histories across place and space in the US, the world, the diaspora that have liberatory models of Black educational leadership. I'm thinking back to Education of Blacks in the South, James Anderson, where he tells the stories of Black Southern communities post-Reconstruction that gathered their limited funds, sharecroppers, and physically and financially built schoolhouses for their children in the South, where we know that they did not want Black folks to be educated. I also have this book here, Hello Professor by Vanessa Siddle Walker, where writes about Dr. Ulysses Baez, who was the first school superintendent, Macon, Alabama, in the wake of school desegregation. And she characterizes him as a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde figure because of the trickster moves that um, he used in his leadership to both present a face of accommodation to white leaders in the district, but also to make sure that the children in his school were receiving a political education and what they needed to navigate the world. We also have more contemporary examples here where the legacy of freedom schools. We know that freedom schools continues to be a space of liberatory literacy and civic learning. And then I also have to acknowledge that as we wade through our current political moment, we see students walking out of schools demanding that their classmates are granted safety and that ICE, is not given, free movement across schools and their communities to detain and harm people. And then lastly, I got to shout out Carter G. Woodson. It is Black History Month. Happy Black History Month to everyone. Uh, I love the work of Jarvis Givens and Fugitive Pedagogies, where he talks about Carter G. Woodson as an abroad mentor. And there's a spatial dynamic to him naming Carter G. Woodson as an abroad mentor. Even though he wasn't physically with Black teachers in their schools, he created conferences, newsletters, networks where Black teachers were able to learn pedagogical traditions that were rooted in Black history and Black politics, to be able to, again, engage in those fugitive practices to make sure our children were getting the education they needed. So while we honor these lineages and legacies that are ongoing, it's also important to name that normative practices in US schools forwards anti-Blackness as the dominant spatial logic. And here, I'm thinking of the work of DeMarcus Jenkins, who actually started us off in this series. And he names that there's a grammar of schooling that the expectations of how students dress, how students comport, discipline policies, where students are expected to be, where they can't be, that excludes Black bodies, that excludes Black children from the schooling resources and institution. It's a spatial logic that is predicated on excluding Black folks. And so I name and ground in that anti-Blackness is a dominant spatial logic in US K through 12 schools. And I also extend that. We talk a lot about what students experience, but I also extend that to Black educational leaders who are working in, normative US K through 12 schools. So we know that Black leaders, they often can be lauded and lifted up for their insight, for their willingness to work hard, but they're also typically overburdened with work. They have untenable work conditions and little support in the form of staff or resources. They also are often subject to surveillance and higher expectation than their peers. We also know that when things go wrong because of long-held educational and racial inequities that persist in schools, Black leaders can be positioned as it's your fault, or positioned as incompetent and unable to lead. And then lastly, I'll say that Black educational leaders can also be positioned as solely responsible for the work of diversity and equity, and in some cases, or the work of school discipline. So normative educational pipelines and structures, they are designed to involve Black leaders in racial disparities and harm. And I say this not to say that that's the work that they're doing, but the structure and the inertia in these institutions, anti-Black spatial logics, works to conscript them in this work if they don't actively fight, and often it wears them down. So to make sense of the lineages and legacies of Black educational leadership that I started with, these otherwise worlds, alongside the anti-Black spatial logic that we see in US K through 12 schools, I want to take up the brilliant work of Dr. Catherine McKittrick that she writes about in Dear Science, and other stories, and her concept of Black livingness. And she talks about Black livingness as a counter to Western epistemologies and knowledge systems that create anti-Black and colonial spatial logics. So Black livingness is a call for us to recognize, honor, notice, uplift Black life, Black joy, Black loving, even amid spatial logics that originate in the transatlantic slavery, plantation, and just morphed from Jim Crow to gentrification to now we see ICE operating as, police and thugs in our street. And so Black livingness calls us to start from Blackness, where we know from our own ontologies rooted in our cultural history. And it works to understand and reorder these geographies that have been harmful and death dealing to us. It centers Black world making and placemaking that has happened across our communities and schools to educate. It also is a collaborative praxis. She talks a lot about, that the work of liberation is already happening. It's ongoing. It can be temporary. It can be sustained. It can be provisional. But it's a collaborative praxis where we're imagining, practicing, and doing the everyday work of liberation. So I employ Black livingness to cast an umbrella over the two studies that I'm going to talk about. And she names that, Black studies and anti-colonial thought are methodological practices where we live, hear, groove, create, and write across a range of temporalities, places, texts, and ideas that build on existing liberatory practices and pursue ways of living the world that are uncomfortably generous and provisional and practical, and as well imprecise and unrealized. And I think it's important to bring up that methods piece because I'll talk about two studies that have different methodological orientations, but important to them is that I hope that you catch the current of different ways that Black livingness and leadership show up in these studies to push against dominant methods that have been harmful and conscripted in the project of anti-Blackness. So my first study that I'll talk about is, this is going back to my dissertation work where I examined the 7 Black families' perceptions of place and school choice decision-making in metropolitan Detroit. And so I got to know and conducted in-depth interviews with 7 families that lived in Redford and West Bloomfield, which are 2 suburbs that have experienced significant Black demographic growth over the past 20 years. And important to this study, I used a critical phenomenological approach, which really uplifts the ontological subjectivity of Black folks, which I see as aligned with Black geographic thought and Black livingness. And it also helps us to see that, oftentimes in studies, Black folks are portrayed with these wide sweeping generalizations, but by tending to how people are remembering, how they're perceiving, how they're understanding their social context, we really can get at the richness of how Black people make sense of schools, of communities, and of what they need to do for their children. So just to give a bit of context, again, the families lived in Redford and West Bloomfield, and both of these places have experienced significant Black demographic growth. You can see the percentages here, but they are very different too. So Redford is an inner ring suburb that is predominantly working class, and it shares an 11-mile border with Detroit. And so families in some way perceive that border to be porous. And then West Bloomfield is a middle ring suburb that is meaning it's further removed from the city of Detroit, and it's also more affluent. And so across these 2 places, I wanted to understand how race, class, and geography also was affecting how families were perceiving places and making decisions about where their kids went to school. So I started with some quotes, and I started with this quote because it is emblematic of how exclusionary spatial logics that we know are present in suburban places were countered by families. It shows how families pushed against dynamics that were designed to exclude them. And so here, Deborah Johnson, a West Bloomfield mother, she talks about Pontiac students. And so in West Bloomfield, there was an interdistrict transfer program where many of the students that came into the district were from Pontiac, which is a majority Black bordering suburb of West Bloomfield, Pontiac, mostly working class students. And in the community, some people were saying, okay, this is bringing the school down. Yeah, we like them because they play sports, but what about our test scores? What about what's happening to the culture of schools? And Deborah Johnson pushed on that. She said, hey, well, first, I like that my children have more Black classmates. And she also said, maybe Pontiac students are bringing the school up. She said she named how it's giving the students who, through no fault of their own, sometimes may not be getting the best education. But she said maybe their classes are better. Maybe their teachers are doing something outstanding. And then she went on to say, just because you're from Pontiac and come to West Bloomfield, it doesn't mean you're bringing anything down. Then important to kind of countering those exclusionary spatial logics that can operate across regions and in suburban places, she talked about poverty and she talked about resource distribution and that, we need to be more equitable. I'll offer two more quotes from parents that demonstrate kind of this democratized form of educational care. Carl Okafor, he was a father of two daughters, and he also talked about appreciating that there were more Black students in the district. He talked about that he would have liked to have his house appreciate more, but then he said it's more affordable for other folks to move in, which is good. And he also talked about liking that it was still close to Detroit. Nita Robinson, another mother in Redford, she was actually a parent leader. She went on to talk about how parents would have a parent party so they could get together and collectively talk about the same things everybody goes through. We talked about resources and what you would do in a certain situation. Everybody is going through the same thing. And so I note how I cast these families as enacting not only a form of educational agency, but a form of educational care and leadership, in that, and opposed to an exclusionary logic or NIMBYism, not in my backyard, these families are trying to understand and trying to forward how they can get a good education for their kid and other Black children, which I call a democratized form of educational care. And so I want to highlight that as like a key theme that shows, how Black placemaking can occur across different regional contexts. Here, Black folks are embodying a communal leadership and perspective in hopes that schools will be accessible not only for their children, but for other children as well. And so I also want to highlight from this study that their sense of place was also multi-scalar, meaning it was across the region. So many of the families grew up in Detroit. The parents had grew up in Detroit. Some of the children had started school in Detroit and then later moved. And families cited things ranging from the cost of living, the affordability of insurance. Some families had experienced foreclosure as reasons why they had, and of course, the state of schooling is reasons of why they moved out. And here I just want to show how their perceptions of place reveal a placemaking that starts from where they know. So the Muhammad family, they lived in Redford, and they talked about that they liked Redford because it still feels like the city, right? The mom went on to talk about that it still feels blue collar. And she talked about a lot of the Detroiters, they shop in the same areas. So again, even though families were faced with these anti-Black structural conditions that pushed them out of the city, they were able to recast the region in ways to maintain their cultural ties, to maintain familial ties, to really stay anchored in Detroit, which was a home place for them. And then I love this quote from Rhonda Foster, who just, even though West Bloomfield, again, this is the suburb that's further out, she just said, I just consider this all Detroit. So she was saying, no matter where I am, I'm still in Detroit. that's my home place. And again, I offer this to show how Black families' leadership and agency is across space. It's across place, and it points towards these alternate geographies that families can create to make sure their families can live with care and dignity and thrive in regions that were not built for them. So now I want to switch to the second study, which is in Seattle. And and I meant to say, so Detroit, Metro Detroit is on Anishinaabe lands. I want to honor the lands on which Black families are moving and making place. And Seattle, this study, this research practice partnership is on Coast Salish lands. And this is a study that involved a partnership between Black families, Black educators, Black district leaders, and also two Black-led community-based organizations. And so whereas the previous study was more so at the familial and regional level, showing Black livingness and leadership, this shows how this can also exist in communal and school-based models, and also employs multimodal approaches. So to share a bit more about the Early Literacy Collaborative, this is, again, a research practice partnership that I collaborated with Dr. Annie Shimaru, Dr. Stephanie Hapton, Dr. Mia Williams, a local school district here, and teams across the University of Washington and community organizations. And so I just want to honor that this was a collective effort. And this all generates from a long-standing research practice partnership that has been happening for almost a decade now, and an office that is particularly focused on the academic achievement of Black boys in the district. Basically, in the school district strategic plan was saying, hey, we need to see increased reading scores, standardized reading scores at the third grade level for Black boys. And so the Black woman school district leader, who I'll call Whitney, basically said, how can we do something that gets the community involved in this? So this is collective work. And as we were talking, we were saying, okay, yeah, test scores, but we have to know that, literacy is more than reading and writing in school. So we're like, how do we take a critical literacy learning, a creative literacy learning perspective to this approach? And more important, how do we build relationships and trust among the students, among the educators, among the educational leaders, so that they have collective agency and power to break from kind of the normative scripts around how teachers are expected to tell families what they need to do. How do we create an environment where educators and school district leaders can learn from those critical literacy practices that families have been doing in their homes and with children? So to give you all some context of our process, we know that we're in, to put it lightly, a regressive political moment. Racial equity work is being attacked, and this showed up in the district. So in I believe the 2022-2023 school year, we had done a collaborative pilot the year before, and we were like, we got a grant, and we were like, okay, we already have relationships with families, we're ready to roll. But in that year, there was a massive budget cut in the school district we were working with, and we saw the race and gendered way it disproportionately affected Black women. And importantly, Black women were at the heart of this work that we were doing. Black women school district leaders, they were the partners, they were the drivers of the work. And so throughout that year, we saw multiple Black women laid off in the district who do racial equity work. And we saw others just depart, given the conditions they were encountering. And as we were trying to get off the ground to start the work with families, things were just changing. And it felt like we didn't even know if we could still partner to do the work. And so one of the community organizers who we worked with, she called us to slow down. she said, okay, we can't operate in a way that is about expediency and urgency. We have to actually move at the speed of trust. And so we slowed down, and it was brilliant to witness how Black women engaged in placemaking by calling on their relationships with other community leaders, by having us engage in what we called Sankofa practice, where every meeting we would begin by talking about histories of survival and thriving that come from our lineages and that have helped us sustain past this political moment. And so just to ground in that, Black placemaking, Black feminist placemaking was key to our ability to get off the ground and actually work with families. So in the next school year, we actually started the work with families, and I want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. uh, Key to that, we had to tap ancestral knowledges, and we use story work as critical literacy practice. So here we see the multimodal nature of Black livingness and leadership. We use the Anansi story to get families to talk about their own trickster figures that come from their culture. We talked about how these stories often unfold over time. Here you see a quilt where students were asked to draw a place of joy or learning that matters to your family and community. So we started conversations that surface these stories, and also surface these stories in ways that acknowledge that they were in place. And this was really important because in saying Black families, the majority of families were East African descent, and we also had African American families. But many of the families had engaged in transnational migrations, had had different home languages from Amharic to Oromo, and so we started by sharing all of this rich knowledge. Eventually, after several meetings, it was so interesting. The crow began to emerge across different families and different groups. And so, in talking about what are these cultural stories, like who are the figures there, people were saying, oh, in our culture, there's a story of a crow. And the crow was named as wise, as watchful, as observant. And some even said the crow was named as mischievous. But the crow emerges across these families as a figure that the young students wanted to tell a story around. We started to co-design a story around the crow. Here you see a brief quote from a parent in discussing why he thought the crow emerged across different families and schools that we were working with. And he said he thinks it's because of its smartness. And then he goes on to talk about, I can say, a kind of wisdom of life. And so that we need as parents is most of the time, Black kids have the capacity, the knowledge, but we need to develop their social emotional skills. These social and emotional skills come with the kinds of wisdom stories that we tell them. So again, he's naming that these wisdom stories contain social and emotional skills. And I will also add that they also contain political and cultural education that I think has been part and parcel of Black educational legacies and leadership. So just to give a glimpse of the story, so the Kings, the students who were seventh through fourth grade Black boys, um, they increasingly became involved in the process. So when we first started off, they were very quiet. The parents were talking a lot, the teachers were talking a lot. But over time, we were like, hey, let's draw, let's do read alouds, let's play, let's do games, and they again, the crow emerged, and one of the students, a second grader, he was like, "Oh, well, I noticed, we're having to navigate between home and school. Things feel different when we have to navigate." And then they decided they wanted to tell the story of Pixie, the little curious crow, who he's holding a fruit that is these wisdom stories, these stories from his ancestor, his family, and community. But then he also gets distracted by the shiny bubble. And they talk about how they have had to navigate across different spaces and places, their home languages, the dominant language of English in school. And they basically talk about these tensions through Pixie, the curious little crow. And here you'll see some of the writing they did, and also some of the illustrations they did to create the book. Key to our process, as we got to the end, we were talking about, well, how are we going to end this? How are we going to land the plane? And basically, the students were like, we should have multiple endings. Why would we just pick one way for Pixie to end up when we all have different journeys? And it was so beautiful to witness how, as these young students flourish in the space, some of them named, oh, well, we'll just stay on the shore. Like the Pixie doesn't get distracted. One of them named they went up to the bubble, that the shiny bubble that represented teachings from school, and it popped. It was an illusion. And so there were all these different ways that students made meaning of Pixie's journey, and that became, emblematic of their own journey. And when we talked with the students about the process, they talked about that they loved that there were multiple ways that they could have, that the story could end. And they loved that they were able to express themselves the way they wanted to. And so just to briefly overview, I think this example shows not only shows the important role of students in Black educational leadership and how they can engage in placemaking through multimodal learning, through providing an atmosphere where they're with their parents, where they feel safe, and where they are supported in teaching their teachers, where their knowledge is honored and uplifted. So quickly, I will share about some of my thoughts around Black geographies of educational leadership. This is some of my wonderings, some of my noticings that I'm still working through. But key to that is that Black geographies of educational leadership, it's a collaborative praxis. So across Metro Detroit and Seattle, we see how people are working together, whether it be families, students, educators, school district leaders, they're working together and they're sharing ideas about how to struggle against oppression. So McKittrick names that, it's not one thing, but it's how are we in community to think about how do we get through this? And then there's also democratized and communal approaches to leadership. So when we use this Western heroic form of leadership, all-knowing leadership, we can't tap the knowledge, the sense of place, the expertise that lives within Black folks to lead and educate our children. And so there's these democratized and communal approaches, whether it be in how families are perceiving schools, or even how we bring folks together to think about partnering and improving learning in schools. And importantly, this work is locally grounded. And so it recognizes that Black people are in place, meaning we have places, we have communities that we've been doing these in places like Sunnyside, in places in and across Detroit. So it reinscribes Black place and world making, whether it be real or imagined. And so real meaning, the co-design work we did with families was physical. We were actually in a school building, right? We came together and created a place. But it also can be imagined. The story of Pixie, the Curious Little Crow, this is from the imagination of these students, of a place where they could navigate, the difference between home and schooling epistemologies, a place where they were supported. And so, again, that placemaking is important. And then I also named that as multi-scalar, multimodal, and interdependent. So going back to the democratized place, this is not leadership that is done alone, in that it's constellations of different people coming together, people across different places. And we're also drawing on all of our different ways of learning and knowing. So whether that be writing, drawing, whether that be providing the resources we have, it's again a constellation of different leadership efforts and caretaking. And it also honors that there are existing liberatory educational practices through situated knowledges. So it's not, we're doing all of these things, activities to figure it out, to share ideas about struggling against oppression. Well, we also know that things are not new. We have spatial histories, we have things that communities have been doing that we build upon. And then lastly, what I'm thinking about is that it affirms the breadth of Black life and humanity. And so even from my own positionality as a qualitative and community-based researcher, I've learned so much from doing work in Metro Detroit and now being located in Seattle. So Seattle, again, the families, they were predominantly of East African. There were some African American families, but these families had transnational spatial experiences, transnational spatial imaginaries. They were talking about, you know, literacy practices that they learned growing up in Eritrea. And Black families were talking about literacy practices they learned, visiting the South from Seattle when they would go visit their grandma. And so just honoring that diversity within Blackness and Black geographies. And that's key, I think, to thinking about educational leadership in a holistic way. Blackness is a place of knowing that we can know from, and also Blackness is so different, and that contains a breadth of ideas that we can learn from. Finally, in affirming Black life and humanity, it refutes and works to undo the practices of Black ineducability. So again, when we have these heroic and savioristic models of leadership, they really are premised on, that we can have a tokenistic person, but we still, we don't believe that folks are capable. We don't believe that communities can do for themselves. So in affirming Black livingness, we affirm that we all have something to contribute in this project of educational liberation and leadership. So again, thank you all for the opportunity to join you all. Thank you for the opportunity to share about my work, and I invite any questions or comments. Thank you so much.
Beautiful. In whatever ways feel good to you. Can you help me thank Dr. Nickson? Hearts, hand claps, and come off of mute if you feel called. But thank you so much, Dr. Nickson, for the beautiful seeds and the lessons that you offered us around collaborative practice, the multi-scalar, multimodal, interdependent constellation of practices that Black families been doing. Other thoughts, questions, and as folks, yes, thought provoking. Thank you for sharing. A lot of love in the chat as well. As you all warm up your questions, Dr. Nickson, I would love to think with you for a minute. I really appreciated your invocation of Adrienne Marie Brown's Thinking at the Speed of Trust, and what she talks about as really setting a foundation for our encounter with what I hear you talking about, knowledge systems. And so I'm wondering if you could talk through just the ethics of calling forth and thinking with Black families. So some of my thinking here, folks are bearing witness, or maybe that's too strong. Folks are looking at scenes that are unfolding both in the United States, transnationally, and some of the there's been some frustration, some where are Black folks in these conversations, and lest we sort of run to Black people and Black families and start saying, share with us all that you know, right, for navigating what were these antebellum slave patrols that have now morphed into what we understand is these sort of ICE raids. Share with us all you know about how you've navigated these anti-Black spatial logics. How should we be thinking about what it means to encounter the wisdom stories, to encounter the seeds and the anecdotes that Black people have as we collectively seek to respond to this moment and the next?
Yeah, that's a timely question. I just first want to name that in both of these instances that I'm talking about, these are majority Black spaces. There were some folks who identified in different ways, But these were spaces where, with that building of trust, it was foregrounded that, you know, nothing here is going to go anywhere in ways that you are not comfortable with, or um, that are not okayed by you at first. So I think with that building of trust, we have to let go of outcomes, right? Or of seeking to fix right away, or to have a solution immediately. I think it has to be more about uh, again, the relationship building and the process of what are you doing here, and how can I be in service? How can I be helpful? How can I walk alongside? Um, and I think that can be tricky, especially me as an academic researcher. But I think that has to be the ethic and logic that any and all Black folks and Black families are approached with, and then let them let you know, how they want to present or share or create. Um, and I think that's the way we navigate this moment, because yeah, just in thinking about even sharing about this work, myself and folks I've collaborated with, especially in Seattle, we have like, okay, like, do we put pictures up? Like, do we how do we represent this work in ways that protects people's safety, knowing that people are being surveilled? And so again, I think it's longer work, it's slower work, it's relational work, but we have to walk alongside people and let them tell us uh, how they want to show up, and also how they want to be represented, and how we take any knowledge forth, if they decide so.
Agree. Agree. Questions, things you all are thinking about? Yes, Professor Hargett.
Hello, Dr. Nicholson. Thank you. This is like a two-part question for you. First, I heard you earlier mention Freedom School, and I am a Freedom School teacher and a doctoral student at Pepperdine. And I like your Sakanfa, and it had Ankh on it because I'm going back to the House of Life at Nefertiti, developing that. And so within that concept of attacking American exceptionalism, looking at what you're doing, and one, I would like to know, do you think if a program like Teaching for Black Lives, I'm redesigning that, if teacher programs were different, we're going to be outside of the HBCUs because we know they're handling their business. Would that make a bigger difference in the classroom if, since we attend many different types of institutions, if a format of that were offered as a second solution, would it make a difference? Because I know from my training, I can use my training all year long, and I tell a narrative, and I teach an adult prison system and juvenile, and it makes a difference in the classroom. It's similar to what you say, and I listen to my scholars and utilize that story, and we weave it in, and it does work, and I'm doing it at a higher adult level. So that part, how much is there an influence from like trainings of Freedom School or things like that? And two, how do you think your program could expand? Would that still need to connect to teacher training?
Yeah, so I will say, so one of the community organizations we partnered with actually does Freedom Schools here. And we intentionally sought them out because, again, in our desire to not just fall into doing literacy learning for standardized testing, but, doing critical literacy learning. How do we teach students how to read the world? How do we acknowledge that Black families have all types of literacy practices, from recipes to the stories we tell to, you know, uh, so many different things. And so I think Freedom Schools is a beautiful model that we actually sought to learn from. And we recognize that, uh, nobody is entirely any and everything. So even as I uplift the Black women district leaders who made place, they still were under tremendous pressure to get the test scores up, right? As educational leaders in this space. And so we had these competing logics that were still in the space. And so part of the reason why, we made the move to have community organizations and bring Freedom Schools in is because that brings a different set of not just ways of knowing, but also organizational demands. We had somebody to counter like, okay, well, how's this going to help the test scores? Well, we see in Freedom Schools that students feel more free. They feel joyful, that they're thinking about their families and communities' literacy practices. And so all of that to say, yes, Freedom Schools. And I think we have to think about how if we want to have liberatory Black educational leadership, how can we learn from places where it's been happening? Because we know it's a struggle within, dominant schooling systems. And then your second question around Black educator teacher pipelines, I think that those, yes, I think we have to continue to do that work. Because with that been doing quote, I started with that because it was something that that EDD students latched onto. They were educators, now they're principals, district leaders, all of the things, but they were like, that's not the way that I see educational leadership. That's not why I came into this enterprise. That's not why I came into this profession. And so I think when we can invite folks who have those communal epistemologies, that have their own Black geographic practices, we remove some of the continued ongoing work to always have to do PD around, diversity, equity, all the things. We need to hire people who are within these communal traditions. And I think the pipelines you're talking about are essential.
And then Sabrina Ross.
Dr. Nickson, thank you so much for this presentation. I know we're short on time. You mentioned that you use as your methodology a critical phenomenology to highlight Black subjectivity. And so I just wondered if you could talk a little more about why that choice for you.
Right. And so, to be honest, it was something I came to through advising from other scholars. So initially I was like, oh, this is a case study, like, oh, I'm looking at a case of Black families across these two suburbs. And as I talked and read more, I talked with others and read more, they were like, actually, no, you're looking at their perceptions. You're looking at how they're making, sense of place. You're looking at their perceptions of place. You're looking at their emotions. You're trying to get the processes behind how they made decisions. And that is more phenomenological in terms of, thinking about how are people experiencing the world. And there's so much subjectivity in how people experience the world. And I briefly talked about, I came to appreciate it more and more because in, Western scientific research, oftentimes Black folks this is what the Black people think, right? This is what is happening amongst the Black people, whereas phenomenological approach really helps you to dig a bit deeper and to understand those insights and those perceptions from the place they come from. And so that can be individual. And one thing that I tried to get at in the larger study is it's subjective individually, but it's also intersubjective. And so Black people are in community with one another talking. They've had shared experiences. So again, in moving away from sweeping generalizations of Black people, it also allowed me to see how Black people do have some intersubjective ways of viewing the world and making sense of place, of making sense of schools, that I think is super important to uplift and understand, to counter kind of some of these dominant conceptions of like, I'm just going to go out here and get a school and seek just for my child. And so I hope that answered your question, but I'm happy to share some resources with you as well, and some of the things that I read.
Thank you for your thank you just generally for this beautiful work. That's a good segue. And so this last question for you, Dr. Nickson, if you have 1 minute, is I love a good reference list. And so if you could share with us, what are you reading? And then where can people find you?
Okay, what am I reading? So currently I'm actually reading a book, oh my God, it's about Octavia Butler. What is it called? Positive Obsession. Is that it? Is that the name? And I don't, if someone
Familiar
has the
topic.
author's name, I definitely want to uplift the author's name. But it's been, I've been reading it slowly, but it's a beautiful book around how Octavia Butler was obsessed with her authorship and writing science fiction. She
Mm,
was a um, true to her craft, no matter
mhm,
what conditions she was encountering, whether it being having to clean houses, having to ride the bus, she still came home and worked on her craft. And she
mhm.
imagined these worlds and made these places uh, to tell Black stories in science fiction. And so um, I highly recommend the book. I haven't finished it yet, but that's what I'm reading now. And then what was the second question?
Where can folks reach you?
Oh, okay. Yeah. And so my email, Susanna Morris. Thank you for dropping the author's name. And then my email is dnickson, Nickson at uw.edu. I'll put it
I
in
can
the
be sure
chat.
to share that with all the folks who register. Sure.
Mhm.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for again for your thoughtfulness, for your willingness to engage with us amid all that is happening in your world and in the world that we're encountering. Thank you all for joining us again. We will have a recording of the event, and so we'll share that as soon as it is ready. We look forward to being in conversation with you all next month for our last conversation with Dr. J.D. Rohn, and that will conclude our Black Geography series. But thank you again, Dr. Nickson, and we look forward to ongoing conversation with you.
Thank you, Dr. Okello, and thank you, Holly. Thank you, everyone, for your insights and much appreciation. And I hope everyone takes care and stays well.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.